We're recording for posterity. It looks like we're coming up on 3 o'clock here, so we're going to go ahead and formally begin. Hello and a big welcome to all of us from Ohio Citizen Action. Thanks for joining us today for our program. It's past time to repeal Ohio's HB6 coal bailout. I'm your host, Melissa English, Deputy Director at Ohio Citizen Action. Before we start today's program, I'd like to go over some brief housekeeping issues. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat box. Please make use of it. Introduce yourself and tell us from where you are Zooming. Check back on the chat box for useful links and information we'll be posting there throughout the program. Also, please note the Q&A box. We will take questions at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions there as they occur to you throughout the program. During our Q&A, we'll also get to as many previously submitted questions as time allows. Finally, if you'd like to stay up to date on all the latest news and action alerts from Ohio Citizen Action, please text the word ADD, that's ADD, to 216-586-6511 and join our texting program. We'll put that number in the chat for you. And now I'd like to introduce you to Ohio Citizen Action's Executive Director, Rachael Belz. Rachael has worked with Ohio Citizen Action since 1996, initially as Cincinnati Program Director and later in other roles until 2013 when she became our Executive Director. During her time with us, she's led many successful and hard-fought campaigns, including pioneering Good Neighbor campaigns that help local communities work with nearby factories to reduce air and water pollution, preventing AMP Ohio from building a huge new coal plant, and helping bring community choice aggregation to the city of Cincinnati. In addition to serving as Executive Director of Ohio Citizen Action, Rachael sits on the steering committees of the Ohio Coalition and the Ohio Climate Justice Fund. She also serves on the executive committee of the Regional REAMP Network. Rachael, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being a part of this 5th installment of Ohio Citizen Action's Conversations program series. We appreciate all of you who have been loyal listeners from the start, and I welcome the newbies to our Convos table. I have to say I'm particularly excited about today's program because my friend and partner in crime, Neil Waggoner, joins us. Curbing Ohio's corrupt utility bailouts has long been at the heart of our work, and he and I are both looking forward to the conversation as well as your questions. OCA has worked closely with Neil and others at Sierra Club for years on this issue especially. We're further tied together by our focus on the grassroots. For new listeners, OCA is the premier grassroots mobilizing and organizing team in the Midwest. We organize and mobilize people in person, by phone, and online, engaging our members and supporters in actions that protect public health, improve environmental quality, and benefit consumers. We've been at the heart of the fight to repeal HB6, which is not only hugely corrupt, but also widely seen as the worst climate policy in the nation. It's amazing what $61 million in bribes will buy you, right? We're seeing that today, right? Playing out as we speak. Well, we've gotten the nuclear part of the bailout, HB6 bailout repealed. It's now time to get rid of the dirty coal bailouts that were added in as well. On that note, it's time to introduce our special guest, Neil Waggoner. There's literally no one who knows more about the hazards of Ohio's coal bailouts, especially OVEC, than Neil. With key legislation pending to finally get rid of them, our conversation today is especially well-timed. Neil holds a BA in history and an MA in US history from Ohio University. After finishing college and grad school, Neil spent several years working in the Ohio legislature. In 2012, Neil joined the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, organizing around a number of issues at the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, the Ohio legislature, and Ohio's congressional delegation. Now, Neil oversees Sierra Club's Ohio coal efforts and leads the Ohio Beyond Coal team. Neil is a Cleveland area native, like so many of our staff members. He's living in Columbus now with his wife, Jacqueline, and their pup, Winnie. Welcome, my friend.
Hey, Rachel, it's good to see you.
Can you believe we picked today?
Yeah, quite a day happening in the legislature as they debate whether or not householders should stay.
Right.
He should not, and
should
it
not.
is more than past time for him to be expelled.
Yeah, and for anybody watching outside of Ohio, this is former Speaker Larry Householder. He's not been the Speaker for quite a while, but he has retained his seat even through an election last November. So literally that debate is happening on the floor of the House right now. So we will see, or maybe celebrate, who knows. We're thrilled to have you, Neil, with us today. Like Melissa said, we're going to begin today's program with a conversation between Neil and me, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Remember to ask your questions in the Q&A box below, and watch the chat as well for info, links, and resources. All right, Neil, you know, we always have to start with some basic but key information because we get in the weeds about these things all the time, but really it's not that hard to understand. As we read about the coal bailouts, we always hear first about this entity called the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, or OVEC. Can you tell folks what this is, who the heck OVEC is, and why we should care about what they're doing?
Sure, I'd love to. So OVEC, the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, what is it? It is basically, it's two coal plants. One coal plant in Southeast Ohio, which is the Kiger Creek coal plant, and one coal plant in Southeast Indiana, which is the Clifty Creek coal plant. These were plants that were built in the 1950s. And they were built under this joint agreement between the U.S. government and a number of utilities to build them together. And the reason for it was that these plants were needed to power the Piketon uranium enrichment facility. This was a facility in Southern Ohio that was enriching the uranium that went into America's atomic weapons through the Cold War. And that facility needed a ton of power, so you have two large coal plants that are built specifically to power it. And that's kind of how things went for roughly the next 45, 50 years. But in the early 2000s, the U.S. government said, you know what, we're not going to need this facility, Piketon, anymore, and we don't need these two coal plants anymore. So at that time, the utilities that operate the plants decided to continue operating them, to operate them as independent power producers, and to use these plants to meet their power needs across several states, several different regulatory markets, and just continue burning coal there for electricity. And that's more or less where we are today. So we are in a situation where these power plants, OVEC is two power plants that have been around since the 1950s, and they are independent generation facilities. Again, that's kind of the basics.
Okay, so that sets the stage for why they exist at all. Now, what I think we got to lead people into is a little bit of, when people think of HB6, whether it's inside Ohio, outside of Ohio, most of us, first focus, or the original focus was on that FirstEnergy nuclear bailout. How did OVEC coal bailouts get into HB6 in the first place to even be having this debate?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially when you consider that when Householder and Friends introduced House Bill 6, they claimed it was going to be a clean air bill. And I mean, including two 1950s coal plants, there's nothing that's clean air about that. So, right. Well, you got to look again at the history. Why is OVEC in House Bill 6? Why is it getting a bailout now? Well, after I mentioned that these utilities, after the U.S. government contract ended, they were going to operate them independently, and that's the decision they made in 2003. And for a number of years, they kind of changed the contract and modified it a little bit, but they just kept operating them. But in 2011, these same companies, roughly a dozen utilities across multiple states, decided to spend a bunch of money to quote unquote upgrade these plants with some new environmental equipment. which it's not necessarily, it's not a bad thing to be trying to install equipment to make plants cleaner, but they had a decision to make in 2011. They could have spent a ton of money. We're talking over $1 billion to upgrade these plants that are already 50 years old, 60 years old, or they could have retired them. They decided to put all this money in, sign a contract through 2040, 30 years, think about it like a mortgage, because it was very expensive.
Right.
And, continue to, and that they would continue to operate. Well, what happens in 2011? Well, 2011 is kind of like where you see the most amount of coal being burned, and then the world changes drastically, as we've seen now, where coal went from the dominant player in the energy markets to, by the end of this decade, it's increasingly likely there won't be any coal plants operating in the United States. So very quickly, after they went into all of this debt with the OVEC plans, the utilities began losing money on it because they were in such debt. And when I say very quickly, I mean they put these equipment in like 2011, and by 2012, these plants were losing money. They were no longer profitable. So what happens? Well, these utilities, and specifically here in Ohio, the utilities that owned chunks of the OVEC contract, FirstEnergy, AEP, Duke, and Dayton Power and Light, which now calls itself AES Ohio, they all started seeking bailouts to the Public Utilities Commission. And when they didn't get exactly what they wanted, they still got a bailout, but when they didn't get exactly what they wanted, then they started looking at the legislature for how can they make this an even larger bailout and protect their profits for an even longer period of time. And that's when we get to HB 6.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So it was teed up a long time ago, and they were ready with their ask, if you will, right? So one other thing that you mentioned that I just want to also sort of share with our listeners here is it's not that common, at least that I know of in other states and even in Ohio, that a bunch of utilities, competitors, go together to own anything, let alone a couple power plants down on the Ohio River in a couple states. So that kind of speaks back to that the original history and all that sort of thing, and just the complicated nature of it, like you said.
Yeah, the utilities. There was a time when you would have several coal plants in Ohio that, like, one unit was owned by one utility, but another unit was owned by another.
Oh, yeah.
And
Right.
what ended up happening is there was a consolidation because it didn't make much sense. But with OVEC, you have a unique contract because it's not like one utility like AEP, who is the dominant shareholder of OVEC, that they own units 5, 6, and 7 at Tiger Creek or something like that. No, what it is that all these utilities that are part of this own a percentage of the overall output of these coal plants. So, it's almost like they have equity in.
Yeah, it's almost like they're stakeholders or shareholders or something like that.
Right. So it is a unique contract. And what we've seen over the years is the utilities themselves try to argue, because of the uniqueness of this contract, uniqueness of this terrible decision that they made, that they therefore need a bailout, that they need an extra little help with it. When the reality is that it's a bad contract, it's a complicated contract, but it's not like that it's not within their purview to change that contract. This contract has been changed multiple times before, leading up to their decision to extend it through 2040.
Good point. So we deal with the environmental parts of this all the time, and we have been for a long time, but there's also the cost side. So the OVEC bailout and the continued bailout upon bailouts is a huge cost to ratepayers as well. Just how much is this coal bailout costing us right now? Can you give us sort of the big picture and what it means for us Ohio consumers?
Yeah, the short answer is a lot. A lot. And the cost of these plants changes on a monthly basis. It depends on market factors. But to throw some numbers out there, the Ohio Manufacturers Association has done some analysis of these plants, and what they have found is they expect through 2030 that these plants will cost Ohioans at least $700 million. Just
$700 million.
$700 million, just an obscene.
Just those two plants, no other plants,
Just
no
those-
other parts of the
just
bailout,
those
just
two
those
plans.
two.
And similarly, Senators Romanchuk and Craig, who have introduced Senate Bill 117 to end this bailout, which we'll talk about in a little bit, I'm sure. Senator Romanchuk, after some analysis that his office did, they've pegged that number at these plants are costing Ohioans $232,000 a day. Just an extreme amount of cost every single day. Again, $232,000 a day. And that is currently under the way that House Bill 6 extended, expanded, and altered the bailout of the OVEC plans through at least 2030, bare minimum. Wow,
it's unbelievable. Such numbers is just really, I mean, it is helpful though to hear it in the daily numbers, because at least it's a number that more of us can grasp, even though it's way more than I would probably ever make in, well, certainly more than a day.
Well, and Rachel, I think actually the numbers here are really important too, because when you start to think about it in like $700 million over the course of the next 9 years, $232,000 a day, like you can start to wrap your head around that this is an obscene amount of money that Ohioans are being forced to shell out. But what legislators that supported this bailout, that were in the pocket of the utilities that wanted it, they'll tell you like, oh, whoa. We're gonna cap, it's capped, it's only $1.50 a month. And most times you're not even paying that much. It's not a big deal. It's $1.50. Who cares? But the reality is that while you, myself, folks on the Zoom today, maybe $1.50 isn't a lot in the aggregate as an individual each month. The reality is that when you add us all together, it's a crazy amount of money. And you start to think about, if we were going to collect $700 million over the course of the next 9 years, 10 years from Ohioans, what else could that go towards? What else could that revenue being spent on? I mean, that's economic development. That's replacement of lead pipes. That's expansion of rural broadband. That is a ton of money into social programs that really directly help Ohioans. Something that we've seen really over the course of the past year is desperately needed, as we've seen just how weak our social safety net is in the state. And instead, we're all paying $1.50 a month to make it so that's $232,000 a day, $700 million over the next 10 years, basically just to protect the corporate profits of 3 utilities in Ohio.
Right. No, that's a really good reminder, actually, for everybody. Okay, so in the past, I've heard you refer to the coal bailouts, even before HB 6, as the tale of 2 power plants. Also, OVEC has made bad business decisions and just wants us to pay for it. You just walked us through that. But it also seems to be the prevailing attitude among all Ohio for-profit utilities. Just get a bailout, and then they can still enrich their shareholders no matter how poor their business decisions are. Can you talk just a bit about the unique political environment in Ohio and why utilities seem to have such an outsized and unfair influence here?
Sure. And, we can look at the OVEC plants were the original. They were where the bailout attempts in this state started. Back in 2013, AEP was the first utility to file an attempt to get a bailout of their share of OVEC. And that attempt led to then FirstEnergy, Duke, Dayton Power and Light, all doing the same, not just for their shares of OVEC, but additionally the Davis-Besse nuclear plant. And eventually, by the time all the cases were filed with the Public Utilities Commission, almost every megawatt of coal in Ohio, the utilities the regulated utilities that were tied to them through their deregulated affiliates were seeking bailouts. Just a crazy amount of coal generation and nuclear generation seeking bailouts. And this is, again, what started the Public Utilities Commission, then went over to the legislature and became House Bill 6. But your question is like, why is this happening? And the reality is that you got to look at how much sway and how much influence these utilities have at the commission and at the legislature. And there are a number of ways and reasons they have it. The big one, first off, they got the money. They've got the money to hire the lobbyists that can be in the legislature every single day. They've got the money to start putting out the campaign donations. And look, I spent time in the legislature. I worked in the legislature. And I can tell you, a couple days a week when the legislature is in session, there are fundraisers around Cap Square. And you go there and you'll see lobbyists and they'll carry in their suit pockets checks that they'll literally hand out. So, and when you've got then, you throw a fundraiser where maybe you just have some like little canapes, some burgers or something like that, and you're throwing down $250 to pay for the fundraiser, but you've got a utility lobbyist who's showing up each time you do that with a check for $500. You start to like talk to that person more. You start to think about that person more and the ability. So, yes, money is a voice, as Citizens United has argued. But it has this impact on utilities. They have that money, they have that influence, they're present. They can always be talking about these issues. So that gives them a lot of sway. Meanwhile, you have things at the commission, the Public Utilities Commission, where anytime a utility goes to file a case there, they have an entire team of lawyers that is working on that case 24/7. They are able to do everything possible to prep for it. Meanwhile, organizations like ours, organizations like that we like the ones that we work with, such as the Ohio Environmental Council, NRDC, LPC, these are organizations where maybe they have like one lawyer or two lawyers that can support a case, but it's part of their overall portfolio. So we go into these commission cases and we're often out-resourced. Again, the utilities bring all these resources to bear to really push things around. And when we go into these cases, we are advocating, we are pushing, we are fighting for certain things. The utilities have a whole different viewpoint because, again, that money that they bring to it, they can go and sign side deals with other interveners in these cases to help get them to join stipulations and settle cases without actually, going and having a full proceeding in which every issue has to be debated. And the commission itself, basically their thing when they decide on cases, on rate cases, does it make sense in the aggregate? Does it support and benefit customers overall? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, depends on how you view it. So again, why do these utilities, why are things like these bailouts ending up on our bills and at the legislature? Is because it's the money and the influence and the ability that these big utilities, these big energy providers, big coal, big gas, big oil, it's all because of that, because they go into these settings, these halls of power and influence, and they are happy to use every resource available to them and to generate their own influence.
Yeah. So it happens at the legislature, happens at the fundraisers. You hit on the PUCO. Let's touch on that for just a second. Why, and I know the answer, but I want to hear you say, why is the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, or the PUCO, why is their oversight not a substitute for finally repealing these bailouts for good?
Well, let's talk a little bit about exactly what HB 6 did to the OVEC coal bailout and why their oversight is not as strong as it even once was. So even previous to HB 6, the Public Utilities Commission had approved bailouts for the OVEC shareholders of AEP, Duke, Dayton Power and Light through the mid-2020s. Was that a good thing? No, it's not really. The reality is these coal plants, since they got bailouts, have been losing money every single month. They have always been a burden to customers. But the utilities at the time, when they got these bailouts, a big argument for them was, they said, like, we know generally how much the OVEC facilities are going to cost, like to produce power at. So if we lock in now, we bail them out now, while prices for power are low, if prices skyrocket, well, hey, it's a hedge. And maybe this will actually benefit customers down the road. So I just mentioned, that's never been the case. These plants cost customers money every single month, and that's been the case for years now. So they use this argument that it was going to be a hedge, which, again, if the bailouts only go through the mid-2020s, then they're going to have to go back. The utilities would have had to go back to the commission, the result would have been like, look, this never worked out. Their case for getting a bailout would have been much weaker. Well, what happened with HB6 is that the legislation changed the regulatory review process of the OVEC bailout. Instead of requiring the utilities to prove why they needed a bailout, why the bailout of the OVEC plants could be a benefit for customers, they changed it instead to changing it to a look back. Is the money that you're receiving, was that prudently used? So they changed the whole review process that the PUCO has available to it to something called a prudency review of how revenue collected and spent is being used. So, how the commission defines prudency? Well, the Public Utility Commission has not. Sierra Club, when after HB6 was passed, we told the commission, you need to set guidelines for what a prudently incurred cost is. And the commission deferred on doing that. The legislature did define what a prudently incurred cost was. So now the commission is going to do a review of the costs associated with the OVEC bailout, but it's not clear like what the parameters for that review are. Like what is a prudently incurred cost? So theoretically, now the organizations like Sierra Club, OCA, others are going to fight this, but theoretically, like, were you just using the revenue you collected from this bailout to pay off debt at the plants? Sure, great, not a big deal. That's prudently incurred cost. That could be an argument.
Yeah.
So that means, again, the PUCO's authority to protect customers from absurd costs is significantly diminished as a result of House Bill 6. And the only way that we get back to full commission authority, even with the challenges of the commission, the only way we get there to this, so the commission has the full authority to protect customers, is if we repeal the bailout, the coal bailout, the OVEC bailout that was part of HB6, and get it back to the commission. The utilities have to demonstrate why they need a bailout and have to go through a full rigorous process again, as compared to just a look back on how they're using their bailout money.
Yeah, exactly.
Our bailout money.
Our bailout money. My money, your money. So that's a perfect lead in to the fact that the repeal of HB6 is incomplete without a full repeal of the coal bailouts for the OVEC plants, the Kiger Creek plant in Ohio, in Cheshire, Ohio, and the Clifty Creek plant in Madison, Indiana. And I know we've said this and sent many postcards out and whatnot, but I still can't believe that we bail out a coal plant in Indiana. It's ridiculous, our dollars. But the vehicle for the repeal right now is Senate Bill 117, which Ohio Citizen Action has strongly endorsed. Can you tell us more about Senate Bill 117, what it actually does and where it stands in the legislature right now?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So Senate Bill 117 was introduced a couple of months ago, and it's bipartisan legislation. It's dual sponsored by Senators Mark Romanchuk, a Republican, and Senator Herschel Craig, a Democrat. And what this legislation would do is it would say, no more OVEC bailout. We're going to repeal all of the aspects of that, how HB6 extended and expanded the OVEC bailout. But the legislation actually goes a step further, and it would end the bailouts that were approved by the Public Utility Commission as well. It would stop the OVEC bailout altogether. So this would be a huge benefit to Ohioans in terms of economics, public health, the environment. It's a huge benefit. Yeah, if we stop this bailout. So the legislation's been introduced, and it has had 3 hearings so far. The sponsors testified on it. In the first hearing. The second hearing was a proponent hearing, and you saw, I think it was 30 groups or individuals submitted testimony just laying out why this bailout was a bad idea. And you see kind of a wide swath of organizations, business interests, economic interests, environmental groups, general members of the public, a huge coalition of people opposing it, are supporting this bill and opposing the bailout. And just yesterday was the 3rd hearing. And it was in this hearing that the utilities themselves were brought in to oppose the bill and to essentially explain their side of the story. So you had up in the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee yesterday, AES Ohio, Duke, AEP, and a representative from OVEC, the operating company itself, trying to answer questions on how this was a benefit. And, it was an interesting hearing, right? Because first, you got someone from AEP up there, American Electric Power. Well, why is that interesting? Well, because American Electric Power has now been subpoenaed by the federal government for their role in the ongoing HB6 felony investigation.
Yeah, and that was like just last week, right? Were they just
last week
AEP?
Last week, American Electric Power was subpoenaed. AEP did give a lot of money to Generation Now, which was the company, the pass-through company that FirstEnergy was giving all of the money to, that householder used as part of or allegedly used as part of this bribery scheme. And for AEP, OVEC was the big thing with House Bill 6. AEP is the largest shareholder of the OVEC plants. The company as a whole is stuck with, however you want to define it, somewhere north of 40% of OVEC's overall output. So that's they're on the hook for a ton of the debt associated with OVEC. So yeah, they testified yesterday, and boy, did they squirm trying to say that the bailout of these plants isn't actually a subsidy, but failing to define a subsidy. They were forced to admit that this has never been a benefit to customers, that it's always cost customers more. And they just didn't have good answers. So the status of the legislation, I think that it is very good that we have co-sponsors that are both a Democrat and Republican. We saw some great questions from the committee yesterday. And like in a normal world, I would be feeling super confident that we were on a winning trajectory right now. But this is Ohio, and as we talked about at the top of the call, the legislature is literally still debating in this very moment whether or not to expel Larry Householder after multiple of his associates have now pleaded guilty. And FirstEnergy, the company behind all of this, is in a deferred prosecution agreement conversation with the feds. So, it's tough, right? I think that we do have some momentum here. I think that there are real questions and real issues from legislators towards the utilities that are getting this bailout. And I don't think the utilities themselves acquitted themselves well, or were able to really adequately answer questions yesterday. But I think in this moment, what's really important, Rachel, I was promoted out of our organizing department at Sierra Club, but I'm not once an organizer, always an organizer. Yeah. So what I'll say is this: what's really critically needed right now, we need those calls, we need those letters, we need those emails, contacting the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee, and we need to be thinking of, okay, once we get this bill out of this committee, what comes next? Because the House, which is even more conservative and has folks like Bill Seitz, who was one of the right-hand men to Larry Householder, is still in House leadership on the GOP side and
Yeah.
doing everything he can to defend this corrupt bailout. So, we need to start thinking, we need to be getting these calls, these emails, these letters in now, and we need to be starting to think about what comes next.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're going to talk a little bit more as we go and make sure that everybody has actions they can take at the end and all that too. But we have to remind people that SB 117 right now, we have to get it passed. One more thing I want to hit on before we get into questions from our listeners and viewers is I know that climate justice and equitable change is crucial to our success in all of this work, and my and our allies in this work here. How can we, how can we center those issues in our efforts to ensure that the people that are closest to the problems are also a big part of finding the solutions? For example, we know the coal bailouts don't really help the communities impacted, even where the coal plants actually are. They're more about a handout to the corporate shareholders, like you said. How can we turn that around and help these communities, even as bailouts are hopefully being stopped?
Well, I think that the first thing we need to recognize is that more coal generation has either retired or been announced for retirement in Ohio than any other state in the country. We have really led the way now. Some of that has to do with the fact that there was so much coal that was here.
Yeah.
But a lot of it has to do with, the simple economic facts of that coal just can't compete anymore. So these plants are closing. And, similarly, as these plants are closing, the mines are closing as well. And again, from a public health and environmental perspective, that's a good thing. But what we have not seen as this is happening is any sort of policy or specific support from the Ohio government, from the governor's administration, whether Democrat, Republican, or from the legislature itself, actually providing support to coal plant communities. So really what we need to be doing is looking, taking this holistic approach of, we know that plants are closing. We know more plants are going to close. We know mines are closing. We know more mines are going to close. And we need to be taking this holistic approach of, what can be done to support these communities, understanding that the reality is these plants are going to close and they're going to close soon. So what can we do to make sure that there is a future for these communities in terms of economic development, retention of essential services? I mean, that's a big issue here, is that when a coal plant closes, that's often the largest provider of tax dollars to the community. Well, when you have a huge hit to your tax dollars, what does that mean? Well, that impacts your fire services, that impacts your emergency EMS services, that impacts your police protection, that impacts your schools, that impacts your garbage collection. I mean, it has a huge impact. So, we need to, as a state, be taking a look at, if a plant's going to close, and for communities where plants have closed, how are we providing more direct support revenue to those communities to make sure that essential services are maintained? We also need to be getting in there early, as looking at facilities that we know are going to close in the near future, and seeing what resources do the communities have right now? What does the workforce look like? We have this privatized Department of Development with Jobs Ohio that's supposed to be all about attracting new companies and new investments in the state. We need things like Jobs Ohio going to every coal community in the state and looking and being like, what can we do to encourage investment here? What can we do to get new jobs here? What can we do to make sure that the folks who are here now are able to stay here and are able to have their kids stay there and continue to have a true community? So again, it's taking this holistic approach to making sure if we want communities to thrive, if we want them to continue to be a community, thinking about what we can do to make sure that it happens, what revenue it's going to take, what investment it's going to take, what does the community itself need and want, what are they, how are the locals on the ground identifying what they need and working with them from there, as compared to, again, what we are doing right now, which is nothing. Right. And the reality is, the way Ohio is set up with a deregulated market, the idea was, when we did that, the idea was that the more expensive generation would be phased out and new generation would come in to replace it. And that's exactly what's happening. That's the thing to remember here is that what is happening with coal plant communities closing, coal plants closing and coal communities, this is the end result of the policies that we created, but we never thought, Ohio legislative leaders never thought about like, well, what comes next? And we need to start thinking about that. We are past needing to think about it.
Right.
About what comes next.
Right. They passed some of these things like deregulation and even some of the standards we'll talk about in a second, in 08. But as we've pointed out many times, there in all of our work, and it hasn't been a comprehensive energy bill. So we've had 21 years of deregulation, but just no actual comprehensive bill to get there. And that's why so many things that were even supposed to be part of it never even became really part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's an important thing to really constantly remember and bring up is that we do not have a comprehensive energy policy in Ohio. We jump from thing to thing. And really, unfortunately, what we're seeing is just like so many different things that are out there in the world that are becoming politicized. Energy is now becoming politicized. Energy is politicized as well, which is like the last thing that you want to have politicized, right? You don't want energy politicized. You don't want water politicized, right? And that's what's happening. And it's why we have now so many different pieces of legislation that are floating around that if you actually talk to some of the legislators behind it, they don't have a good description of why they're doing something specific. It's a totally partisan issue.
Hey, friend, great news.
Yes.
Householder was just expelled.
Oh, hey. Well, Rachel, I feel like you getting to break this news to me is not unlike a fun story for everyone on the call. Rachel and I were on a call a number of months ago where I finished the call by making a comment because this was the morning that Sam Randazzo, former chair of the Public Utility Commission, resigned in disgrace from the commission. And I made a comment about his resignation and then signed off this call. And I realized, and I only found out later that I broke the news to Rachel that happened. So
I had joined the call like a few minutes late. You all had barely talked at the very beginning about it. I guess you all thought I was on with some reporters or something. And we went on with our business of a half-hour call. You left early and you said something about Randazzo Day. Yeah, 75-21.
Wow.
That's huge in Ohio because for most of us, you probably know this, or some folks outside, it's all Republican. It's very, very, so this is Republicans and Democrats coming together to do this. And I will say that the vote just a couple of hours ago to even allow this to bypass the committee and all that after Householder gave witness yesterday. The vote just to change the rules, if you will, to do this was 66. So he literally lost more people in expelling him than in just changing the rules in the first place. I think that actually, if anybody gets a chance, you should look at the Ohio channel's Larry Householder testimony yesterday afternoon in the Rules and Regulations, House Rules and Regs Committee. It was a sight to behold.
This is really quite a moment, and I'm
huge.
Yeah, and I'm looking. I see some of the reporters have posted pictures of the voting wall, and it is interesting to see though the folks in that 21 nay category. Some of the folks that are on there, you'll recognize the names as names behind House Bill 6: Jamie Callender, Dick Stein, Representative Wilkin, and of course Bill Seitz.
And I'm assuming Householder got to vote on himself.
Yeah, it looks like he did in fact decide he voted no on.
He did not abstain.
He did not abstain, but yeah, a lot of the folks that were really tied up with House Bill 6 in 2019 still seem to be standing with Larry Householder. But yeah, quite a moment to have.
That is huge.
Boy, yeah, quite a moment to have him removed.
Watching yesterday, I have to say it's exactly the right, no matter what party he would have come from or anything, it is exactly the right thing to happen because it was clear that he, at the very least, still wanted to be in charge and in some ways was. And that's incredibly dangerous. I mean, when they talk about disorderly conduct as the reason to expel, I mean, you can't even get the House business done. So,
well, it really feels like it's a good opportunity now to fully repeal House Bill 6.
okay, so what's left? Right. Okay, so let's just say that Senate Bill 117 passes and we do actually get rid of the OVEC coal bailouts. We mentioned earlier that the nuclear bailouts have been repealed, and I think it's worth it for the viewers to know that the company that was supposed to receive those nuclear bailouts, Energy Harbor, actually said before that, oh, we don't want it anymore anyway. So what's left? I know you know this, but what's left in the, the original bill?
So of the various buckets that were part of House Bill 6, the nuclear bailout, the OVEC coal bailouts, some financial mechanisms that benefited FirstEnergy. The big thing that's left now is House Bill 6 also essentially ended Ohio's renewable energy standard, as well as Ohio's goals around reducing energy waste, so energy efficiency programs. Currently, the Ohio's renewable standard is set to end in the next few years once it gets to a certain threshold. Previously, the threshold was higher and it was supposed to extend indefinitely. Now it just ends. And then, we had energy efficiency. This was a big part of House Bill 6, a big part of Ohio energy policy in general. These are the programs that, would reduce the amount of energy needed. And, these were programs that were saving customers money, reducing the amount of power we need, really successful programs. And House Bill 6 ended those. So, we really need to get rid of everything so that we can get back to having renewable goals, true renewable goals that are, and let's be clear, our renewable standards, our goals in Ohio are pretty meager to begin with, but we need to get those back. We need to strengthen those, and we need these utility efficiency programs back too. Like, these programs were successful and they were working, and ending them it comes to no one's benefit.
Exactly. It's just an ideology. It was an ideological move that they took advantage of. Yeah. Okay, we're going to go into our lightning round here. Not really, but here's some questions from our audience. I've got a few of them. Who are the biggest consumers of electricity from these two plants, the OVEC plants? Where will they get electricity if the plants close?
So the big thing with these plants is to recognize is that these plants they're in PJM. They're in the 13-state grid region that Ohio is part of. And the reality is that we have more than enough power in PJM, in our grid region, to keep the lights on. Right now, we have an overabundance of power.
Yeah.
So the reality is that if these plants close, it's not going to be an issue of that we're suddenly going to have issues of grid reliability. We're not going to. There's enough power out there. And what's another interesting point here, talking about just the economics of these plants, we could end the bailout today. No more dollars collected from us as of now, but the utilities are still on the hook for these contracts through 2040. So it doesn't necessarily, ending the bailout doesn't necessarily end these plants. It doesn't retire these plants. That's a whole different conversation. We should have that conversation, but it's a completely different conversation. And the utilities themselves acknowledged that yesterday in the hearing on SB 117, where they said, if we end the bailout, things get more expensive for us. Well, yeah, because you got to pay for it.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that those plants close down. So that's an entirely different conversation. So I want to make that very clear. The bailout ends. That doesn't mean that these plants are going to close down. And even when these plants do retire, there aren't going to be any issues with grid reliability.
Right. That's a great point. Okay. FirstEnergy, one of our dear, dear friends. Why do they want out of OVEC? And this is a question from our audience. So if there's more to that you can help explain, that would be great.
Yeah. So it's FirstEnergy Solutions, now Energy Harbor, which had a big chunk of this. Now Energy Harbor, FirstEnergy Solutions. This was the deregulated generation affiliate. So this was when Ohio decided we're going to deregulate our electricity. What we did is if you had one utility that owned the lines and everything that went into your house, as well as the generation that was putting the power into your house, all that generation was broken off. And so now you had two companies. You had the regulated side, which is making sure the power gets to your house, and the deregulated generation side, which is actually producing the power. So FirstEnergy Solutions was the deregulated generation affiliate of FirstEnergy. It's now known as Energy Harbor, and it owned a number of plants, including the two nuclear plants, Davis, Bessie, and Perry. And then it owned a small chunk of OVEC. So this company, as it went into bankruptcy a couple of years ago, one of the first things it did was try to dump its share of the OVEC plants because, well, they were losing a ton of money. Right. And bankruptcy is a great way for companies to dump their expensive assets, and that's what they wanted to do because they knew that it was going to keep costing them money. And as they were trying to figure out how do we become profitable again, holding on to it just wasn't going to be the case. So, that's why they wanted out of it. They projected that these plants are always going to lose money, and they didn't want to be part of it anymore.
So somebody was attempting to make a good business decision after many, many bad ones.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was one of the things in Energy Harbor, FirstEnergy Solutions bankruptcy filing. I mean, that was one of the first things they sought to do was they wanted out of that contract. And what was interesting is that not all of the other companies behind OVEC bought that because they saw this as the problem. Well, what happens if, does anyone want to buy a chunk of two failing coal plants? No one wants that. There's no one knocking on the door to get to become a shareholder in these plants. And that creates a problem then, because if no one's going to buy it and Energy Harbor is allowed out of the contract, well, what happens with their chunk? Does that mean that everyone has to take a bite of that?
Right.
Yeah, no one wants it. No one wants to take on that additional debt. So that was a big part of the bankruptcy with all these other utilities, AP, Duke, Dayton Power and Light, utilities in other states, all fighting to say like, no, you're stuck in this with us. And that has continued to happen. Now, it's important to note again that this was the deregulated affiliate that was getting this, because this is another thing with House Bill 6. Is that FirstEnergy customers, so Cleveland Electric Illuminating, Toledo Edison, the folks up in Northeast Ohio, Northern Ohio, weren't paying for the OVEC bailout previous to HB 6. Now everyone is paying for it, and all that money that if you're in the Cleveland area, you're paying for the OVEC coal plants, and all that money that you're paying is now being turned over to the other utilities.
Yeah, exactly. One of the questions we had was about whether or not if the plants were publicly owned, would they cost consumers less? And I would actually argue, based upon what we just talked about, no. And also because in another plant that is municipally owned by a lot of communities, Prairie State coal plant in Illinois, which a lot of us fought in the first place, municipally owned, and it's costing billions. It's all about the business decisions. And so you can have publicly owned bad business decisions, municipals, co-ops don't always, it's interesting, but you can kind of have, it doesn't even have to take corruption. It's oftentimes just not taking advantage of good business practices.
Right. And now the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio conducted an audit of the OVEC plants, the OVEC bailout a year ago. And some of the things they found is there are practices that are being done at the way that these plants are being run and dispatched into the market it's costing customers more. But that doesn't have anything to do with if they are municipally owned or if they are owned by these other utilities or they're owned by this operating company. The practices can be bad no matter what. As you said, like Prairie State is a boondoggle. There are, if you in energy circles, I think two of the worst contracts and most maligned contracts that are out there are Prairie State and OVEC. And, so again, is the ownership going to be different? The only thing that would make the cost different is that if you had like a single entity that owned OVEC, maybe it would be a little bit easier to stop a bailout, because right now what you have is the OVEC contract. You have utilities across, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia that are all that all have chunks of OVEC. In all these states, their structures, their regulatory structures are different.
Yeah.
And they play off of that, say like, well, Ohio is getting a bailout, so now we need to dump this on to our regulated customers. And you see that happening. So if it was by one entity, maybe it'd be easier to stop the bailout. But in terms of just the day-to-day costs, nothing's going to happen. There wouldn't be a difference, because this all goes back to these plants. All the companies behind it made the bad business decision to put these plants into a huge amount of debt 10 years ago, and we're all now paying for that.
Yep, exactly. Well, obviously this is going very fast. I'm going to give a few more reminders here at the end. Thank you everybody for being with us. I want to remind everybody to follow Ohio Citizen Action via Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Remember to join our special Repeal HB6 Facebook page. Has all the latest there. We run it, but we're not the only ones in it. It's a private page, so we have lots of great info for you. Check out our website, ohiocitizen.org. Sign up for our email action list on the homepage and become an OCA member. To join our texting program, text ADD to 216-586-6511. Check our other campaign sites at repealhb6.com and watchingpuco.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find a recording of this conversation. I know Neil and I are going to watch it later. Just hang out and have some drinks, watch it later. You can watch any past convos with Rachael and other OCA original content. I want to first thank Neil. Thank you so much for being here. We joke that, this is your life. It seems like it's just been going and going and going, but it does seem as though our side of the equation has momentum.
Yeah, absolutely. This OVEC bailout issue is incredibly frustrating. And, Rachael, you and our organizations have been working together to stop it we actually launched our no coal bailouts campaign was launched summer of 2014. So August. So we are at almost 7 years now. But the reality is, we see coal plants are retiring in the state. We see where, we have really made a huge impact in carbon and sulfur dioxide and NOx reductions. We really have the momentum here. And with something like OVEC, something that's complicated and the utilities are really counted on just being a black box that no one's going to understand. That's changing. And I think conversations like this, I think that the amazing work that grassroots folks are doing on the ground is changing that. And we're going to continue to see coal retirements happen, which are good and necessary. And, we're going to see an end to this OVEC bailout.
We absolutely are. And how can you all help? Well, remember on Senate Bill 117, call 888-OHIO-123 toll free. That's 888-OHIO-123 toll free. Ask them to connect to your rep's office and urge them to vote yes on Senate Bill 117. I want to thank all of our Ohio Citizen staff for helping to put this on. They're all the back office here, really doing all the great work. All of our OCA members and everybody watching. I want to encourage you to watch for the next Convos installment, which is in September. We're planning that now. And this concludes the program. Again, thank you very much, so much, Neil, for coming here and talking. And one more, let's give a little shout out for Old Householder. Can't believe he's gone. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Rachael.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.